nature of God is to be in relationship with us. This is all that God has sought to do with us from the beginning, is to be in relationship with us. If we look at anything throughout the scripture story, is that we find this God who is seeking constantly to be in relationship with us. That seems to me, the nature of God. If we grasp anything from the Genesis story, is the deliberate act of the authors to show leaders of the ancient Near East that there was another God in the scene, and that this God was indeed a loving God, a merciful God, a compassionate God, not like the gods of the time and the region. Indeed, the passages we read are stories that tell us how the God of the beginning, the Bereshit, which means to begin or to start, the God who got the whole thing going, had a special project for the human race. In Genesis 1:27, we read a story that describes for us a God who very intentionally has called humanity to be God's image bearers. Now, for many of us today, it's not a big deal. I mean, after all, we hear this often in some of our churches. Yet, the Genesis creation stories sought to present to the ancient world that the human beings God had created have a special role to play in the created order. The Genesis narrative presents us with the origin of the human race as a special action, an act of divine purpose for the human race. Let us make humankind in our own image, according to our likeness. Different from the other creatures in the world, humans were created in the image and likeness of God. They were created to have dominion over the earth. And although many have used this passage to declare that human beings can do with the world's resources, even people, whatever they want, that is not what the author or the divine is proposing in this narrative. The narrative changed the long-held belief in the ancient world that human beings were created as slaves of the gods, people subjected to meet the needs, impulses, and caprices of the gods. The author of Genesis declared that human beings were made in the image and likeness of God to be in charge, to take care of the created cosmos. That is why human beings were put in the garden, to till it and to keep it, so that their dominion is not about lording over the land, but rather about them having authority to care for the world that God created. That is, to be stewards of creation. Regrettably, things not always end where they are supposed to. In our narrative, we are told that humans disobeyed God, that in their desire to be like God, they acted contrary to the will of God. But even though this God punished them, God did not kill them, nor did God decide to start the experiment all over again. No, this God decided that now that we have become like God, knowing good and evil, it was time for a different type of relationship to ensue. The Genesis narrative shows that we can certainly disobey God and God's purposes for us, but that this God is certainly not done with us. Clearly, there were consequences to their actions, and they require knowledge. Indeed, what happened in this story shows us that the human race has been in an eternal spin, a spin that will cause us to create our own gods in order for us to declare what is good or evil. This is not according to God's will, but according to our own will. We then, in our arrogance, have come to decide who is good and not so good, based on our own ideas of what constitute goodness or evil. We, of our own devices, have decided who is in and who is out. But that was not God's intention in Genesis. Even after humanity's disobedience, we have come to believe that we can determine who is holy and who is unholy by how people fit into our neatly designed criteria. Jesus was in until he challenged the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the scribes, the high priest, the temple authority, and the imperial power of Rome. Jesus' message of salvation and redemption challenges the very nature of what our world, our religious institutions, and our political powers have declared as the acceptable understanding of the divine. Jesus' conflict with the powers and principalities of his time clearly placed him outside the acceptable group. At one point or another, we have all turned him into an undesirable because he does not fit our criteria of goodness. That is, someone who does what he is told and maintain the status quo. Jesus even challenges us as a church today. Undeniably, Jesus' death expresses in all its power that he was a threat to the powers of evil in the world. Jesus was murdered because of what he said and did. He was a rebel. As N.T. Wright reminds us in his work, Jesus and the Victory of God. Crucifixion was a powerful symbol throughout the Roman world. It was not just a means of liquidating undesirables. It did so with the maximum degradation and humiliation. It said loud and clear, we are in charge here. You are our property. We can do what we like with you. It insisted coldly and brutally on the absolute sovereignty of Rome and of Caesar. It told an implicit story of the uselessness of rebel recalcitrance and ruthlessness of imperial power. It said in particular, this is what happens to rebel leaders. Just like Jesus. Jesus was murdered because his message was a declaration to the world that the God of Genesis continues to call us to live into the reality of the image of God, the Imago Dei. This is a call that God has placed on every human heart. The God that is revealed in Genesis is a God who loves to be in relationship with us. This is the God who sends Jesus to the world in order to reconcile the world to God. And this is the same God whom, after Jesus' resurrection, is sending us in the same way that Jesus was sent to witness. So this is the same Jesus who then calls on us to follow him. But not just to follow as people follow teachers in antiquity. No, Jesus' call was, if anyone wants to follow me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and then follow. No wonder Paul declared that the power of the good news is in the cross, not in how much one has, how big is our army, how well one speaks, or if one lives in a democracy or a dictatorship. The power still resides in the God who in Genesis created us in God's image and likeness. This God did not exclude anyone from the call to witness to God's love, mercy, compassion, and justice, and neither should we.